Welcome again, everyone. My name is Jason Casellas. I'm the Wynant Visiting Professor of American Government here at the Rothermere American Institute. So welcome once again to Oxford. Well, we have an interesting panel on rising demographics and their impact on 2024. Before we go into it, I'm going to briefly introduce all of our panelists. Their full bios are on the website, so I won't introduce them fully, so you can look up more information on them. First, let me start immediately on my right, Bettina Inclán, who served as NASA's Associate Administrator for the Office of Communications during the Trump administration. She was responsible for external and internal communications and served as a liaison to the White House and the National Space Council. She spearheaded Hispanic outreach for the Republican National Committee and crafted strategies at the National Republican Congressional Committee, and she's an alum of FIU, Florida International University.
Go Panthers.
Go Panthers. Okay. And to Bettina's right is Professor Patrick Egan, who's a professor of politics at New York University. He specializes in U.S. political attitudes and behavior and their consequences for public policy, partisanship, and identity. He's published books in peer-reviewed journals. His PhD is in political science from Berkeley, master's degree in public affairs from Princeton, go Tigers, and a BA from Swarthmore College. And he also serves as an NBC News elections analyst. And to Pat's right is Karen Finney. Karen Finney has worked at the intersection of politics, media, and cultural change for over 25 years. She's been a Democratic communications strategist and spokesperson, commentator for CNN and MSNBC, and currently works as a political commentator for CNN. And last but not least, Todd Harris on the far right there is a Republican media consultant and communications executive who has directed some of America's major campaign wins in the past 20 years. He's graduated from UCLA.
Go Bruins.
Go Bruins, while we're on it. And is from California. He's worked for Governor Schwarzenegger, press secretary to John McCain for president, and advisor to Senator Rubio. All right, so let's get into it. And I want to start with, as the title says, our two main political parties are preparing, apparently, to nominate the two oldest candidates for the White House. You know, is American politics being increasingly defined by this clash of demographics? So that's sort of our first question. And I want to start, I think, maybe with Patrick, who can tell us a little bit more about the generational divides in our country, and in particular, some policy issues that might be more particularly salient among younger voters.
Sure, yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Jason. So I study political behavior from the quantitative side, so you're going to hear some translation of the numbers of the kinds of things that I work with on a day-to-day basis. And it is the case in almost every election that younger voters are more liberal than older voters. That's just sort of a year in and year out phenomenon, and that is, of course, true today. And has been true really in probably all the elections that you're familiar with in your lifetimes in the U.S. What is, I think, a little bit different is that the younger generations are staying liberal longer. And so particularly the millennial generation, if we define millennials as those born sometime after 1980, let's say, those folks who typically now in their parent years, in their 30s and 40s, would be expecting to be moving in a conservative direction, are doing so in a much more slow pace than previous generations. And of course, the youngest generation, Gen X, is much more liberal, much more democratic than all the other generations, but of course they're young. Now here's the thing, is that younger generations are consistently outvoted by older generations in the United States. And this is why to call our country a gerontocracy is no joke, because it's not just that the country is ruled by folks who are old. The folks who are electing those people are old. And so if you look at some numbers, the turnout in the last two presidential elections among voters under 25, about 4 in 10 turned out in those elections. Compare that to voters over 75, 8 in 10. Okay, so older voters are outvoting younger voters by about a 2-to-1 ratio. And of course, that has all kinds of downstream impacts on who gets elected, what kinds of policies get elected, get made, et cetera. Big issues dividing the generations, certainly climate change, and that is one where even younger Republican voters who take conservative positions on a lot of other stuff, you see some openings among young Republican voters on climate change. That is something that you see them expressing some concerns. And also, I would say this constellation of issues around gender, gender identity, sexuality, and even less so, but somewhat also abortion, are issues where younger people of all political orientations are a little bit more on the liberal side compared to older people. And we see these kinds of intergenerational debates playing out in elections. And again, one thing to keep in mind throughout this conversation is in the background here are younger voters just not showing up at the same levels as older voters. And so their voices are not heard, and don't need to be heard as much as older voters in the American electorate.
Thank you, Pat. Karen, maybe we can hear from someone who's worked in politics. I mean, do many of these younger generations, like Z and millennials, see their priorities actually being addressed by any of the major political parties? And if not, sort of what do you think needs to be done to address these issues?
Sure, increasingly, yes. And I'll just mention, because you didn't have a chance to mention, I was on the board of NARAL Pro-Choice America for 10 years, so I've been working in the pro-choice movement for about 12 years. And I will start with that issue because what we saw there, I mean, I will say that in 2022, racism and sexism really changed the way, really blinded people to this idea there was going to be this red wave. Many of us were looking at data very early on and said, no, women aren't just going to shut up and go sit down or be worried about the cost of eggs. And no, actually, the way Black people and brown people think about reproductive freedom has really shifted. And young people were a huge driver in that. And it's not just that it's access to abortion, but overturning Roe v. Wade essentially made a lot of, for many women and young women where we're talking about bodily autonomy, it was about, as Kiki had mentioned in the earlier panel, taking something away that you thought you had perceived. It also impacted more women more broadly if you say there could be a national abortion ban, because the truth is low-income women of color have always had issues with access to abortion. And again, I think younger voters were huge drivers of many of these conversations and really, along with a lot of work, obviously, on our side, kept these issues front of mind. And so I think that's a big part of why it played such a big role in 2022. And it continues to be a top issue concern for women, moderate Republican women, independent women, Democratic women, and young women. And additionally to what Patrick was mentioning, when you talk about climate change, when you talk about LGBTQ issues and other issues around sexuality, and just the diversity of younger voters, I think we should mention. We in 2016, we were sort of asked. I worked on Hillary's campaign, and there was this question: is diversity destiny? Nah, not quite in 2016. But actually, increasingly, I think millennial and Gen Z voters they'll be the majority of voters by like 2028, 2030. So if they show up in the kinds of numbers that we actually saw them participate in 2022, and there was a special election in Wisconsin where they really, blew the doors off. If we see that again in 2028, yes. That being said, I think there is absolutely a frustration. I mean, when you talk with young voters, I think they see Biden and Harris addressing those issues better than, as Joe Biden likes to say, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. Yes, absolutely. But not to the degree I think they would like necessarily. But it's certainly within our party something we are having to, because we are a Big Ten party, having to be very mindful of in the diversity. And I will say one of the areas that I think could be a challenge is when we look at what's happening in the Middle East. You have more young American voters who, it's not that they don't support Israel, but they are expressing different perspectives about what's happening to the Palestinian people. And so there's some conversations starting to happen in the United States about, is that going to have an electoral impact? And as the previous panel said, I don't think we know the answer to that yet because we don't know what's going to happen. But certainly the changing demographics of young voters, the issues that they care about, I think we've even seen this in the Republican presidential primary, is changing, has a huge impact on the issue landscape. I think it's part of the reason why Republicans are recognizing that they're in real trouble on reproductive freedom as an issue. Todd disagrees with me.
Okay.
This is gonna be, we both went
So
to UCLA, but
I'm sure, Todd, I'll ask you a question, and you can address Karen's point there. But one of the things about generations historically has been that as generations age, right, they become more conservative over time. Is that something you think Republicans are counting on, or is that something that you think won't happen with this generation? And then, of course, you can comment on some of the things Karen said.
It's not happening with Gen Zers or millennials. They are both sort of bucking the historic trend. They are not becoming more conservative as they age, but at least as of now, that vote is being offset by the fact that older generations are becoming more conservative. I would say Gen Zers to me are a bit like a generational ticking time bomb. They are the most racially diverse. By a 2-to-1 margin, they are most likely to self-ID as not just liberal, but very liberal, which is twice the rate of the larger population as a whole. They are also, while the most liberal, they are the least partisan. They are the most likely to register as no party or independent, which means that while today the Democratic Party, I think, is doing a really good job of renting the vote of Gen Zers, they don't own them, and it's a big part of it is because of the disillusionment that you addressed. They don't see the issues that matter to them the most being addressed by either party. It's just a bigger problem for the Democrats because they make up a bigger chunk of the Democratic coalition. I would also say that Gen Zers are not monolithic. There is a huge, huge difference between a Gen Z voter that lives in a purple or a red state versus a Gen Z voter that lives on the coast. And most of the attention and the focus is on Gen Z voters as being sort of these progressive, kind of warriors on the left. But if you go to purple states and red states, you will find, and in fact, in virtually every red state, the Republican candidates carry not just a plurality, but a majority of the Gen Z vote. Democrats do better among that demographic than they do certainly with older voters in red states, but these are still young voters who are voting Republican. On the issue of abortion, I agree with what Rob had said before. I do think it was a huge mistake in 2022. There was a sense that that if we just stayed focused on the economy and did not engage on the issue of abortion, that that would net out in our favor. And I think a lot of people, I think there were a lot of races that were lost very narrowly, probably because of that issue. In 2022, 20% of all advertising in House races was on the topic of abortion. 98% of that 20%, those ads were run by Democrats. So this was not an issue that Republicans engaged on. When we did, and did it successfully and showed that whoever the candidate is, that perhaps their position was not quite as extreme as voters were being led to believe, Republicans did well. But where we didn't, and we just ceded that territory over to the opponent, it hurt us for sure.
Yeah, did you want
I
to?
disagree, but I'll let us keep. Well, no, actually, I will.
I'm
Actually,
shocked.
I know you are. Actually, that was what you just said is a big part of the miscalculation that even a number of people in my party made. And I will say that it took months to get many of the leaders in the Democratic Party to believe that reproductive freedom was actually going to mobilize voters. for women, it is an economic issue. And for women, the idea of, when and how and if to start a family, that is economic. And so people kept saying the economy, the economy, the economy, and women were kind of saying, okay, and what about my rights? What about, that is my economy. If I can barely afford the family that I have, I can't afford to have more children. Also, I would just say that, I think this is why I said, I think racism and sexism really drove this idea that there was going to be this red wave without listening to what people were saying. I mean, I remember in one focus group, a woman said, look, the economy will come back, but my rights won't. And so I think both sides, for a time, really missed just how deeply women felt about this issue. And I also think that you're seeing Republicans now trying to modify the conversation along the lines of what Nikki Haley is doing by saying, well, 15 weeks, and and we shouldn't criminalize. And I will say, I think the other thing that really has continued to move people and continue to create real concerns is that many of the things that we said would happen are happening when you criminalize women and doctors, when you have literally women dying from miscarriages because doctors are afraid to intervene because they're not sure if they're allowed to or not. And frankly, Todd, the truth is the very most extreme policies are being passed in red states, and that is frightening to people.
Okay, let's shift. We can come back and talk about abortion in a second, but I wanted to bring Bettina in and talk a little bit about the Latino vote, especially as we think about rising demographics in the United States. Latinos are among the fastest growing groups in our country, along with Asian Americans. And if you look at the 2020 election, Latino support for Biden was 8 points lower than support for Hillary Rodham Clinton in 2016, which is the largest drop of any racial ethnic group. And if we look at those who did shift, generally they were persuaded by issues like criminal justice and immigration, and tended to be very conservative, Catholic, but also of low socioeconomic status. And it was geographically broad. This was not isolated to Texas or Florida. And so I wanted to ask Bettina what she thought about this. Is this a structural change you see in this 8 percentage point shift, or was it a fluke? Is this likely to persist? What are Republicans doing to reach out to Latino voters? And then later I'll get a perspective about how Democrats are trying to reach out to Latino voters as well.
All right. Thank you. So I've worked on multiple presidential campaigns that are the Republican National Committee and the Congressional Committee, and it's interesting because it comes up a lot. And one of the things I will first say, I don't think that there is a Latino vote, and I don't think there's a woman vote. The United States is such a huge nation. To say that there is one vote that represents millions and millions of people, I think is just incorrect. What we were able to do at the RNC and what we did on a lot of presidential elections, and I think since then the party's done even better, is have outreach. I don't think demographics are destiny. I think that people want for you to care about their vote. And what we've seen with the Republican Party is when we do that outreach, when we go into those communities, when we do those campaigns, those numbers go up. I'm originally from Florida, and I joke around, my mom is Cuban, my dad is Mexican. That makes them divorced. So, I didn't come up with that joke, but I stole it. But they have nothing in common other than they have 2 children. The food is different, the language is different, the culture is different, and creating campaigns that are smart enough, that engage in those different communities and understanding those issues. There are things that tie them together. Generally, Hispanics will say that the economy is a top issue. Hispanics are also a younger demographic of the United States by about 10 points the average American. There's a huge amount of Hispanics who are under 18, so we have I think that I read, there was one statistic, and I have helped with this because I have 2 children, that 1 out of every 4 kindergartners is Hispanic in the United States. And I think that changes your priorities, because you are fighting, how am I gonna have a better economy for my kids? How do I make sure that the sacrifices that my parents made, I am living up to it? And it's a guilt that you deal with on every day. And I have a wonderful group of friends that we talk about, and I use them as my little focus group. We've known each other from college. Half were liberal, like Bettina, your crazy Republican friends, and half are conservative. And a lot of them, as they've had children, their positions have changed. And I'm not saying that that is everybody, but I think that they have seen outreach. They have an effort. And what you saw in the Republican National Committee was a sustained effort. When we were there, we started opening, and this was under Mitt Romney, we started the first offices in super Democrat, super Latino districts in Nevada. We started doing outreach in areas that Republicans had never gone. And it's consistent. And the issue that my friends on both sides of the aisle, they would get very frustrated is that the people that are running campaigns who don't always look like us only care to reach out to minority groups like 2 months before the election and suddenly decide like, hey, why didn't the voter turnout be higher? Because like they know it's not authentic. You have to have long-term engagement to reach out to these voters. And I think that's what you saw with the RNC for the last 2 years, what you saw with Trump, what you saw with Ron DeSantis, what you saw in parts of Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley, and you saw that across the board because it wasn't just, it was very sustained campaigns, and I think someone said this, you said it before, when I was leading these efforts, what I did in Florida for Cubans or for the different Puerto Ricans was completely different what I did in New Mexico or what I did in or North Carolina. And I think having smart campaigns that know those differences, that there are ties that bind, but knowing that there is no Latino vote because it's too diverse and it's there's too many complications and nuances that you have to address.
Okay, thank you. Karen, did you want to chime in on the Latino vote?
Amen, yes, and as the kids back home do, it's 100% true, and I think it's true on both sides, frankly. I think Democrats have gotten better, but yeah, women are not monolithic, African Americans are not monolithic, Latinos are not monolithic, Asian Americans are not monolithic, but unfortunately, for too long, people at the top making decisions have treated people as, generally monolithic, and so, and I do agree that it is the most effective, particularly when we're talking about younger voters, because social media and technology is a way to have an authentic conversation, a two-way conversation, and I think understanding where young voters are, how they want to be communicated to. I think both sides are doing a lot better than we did. I remember at one point in 2016, someone's like, okay, well, we have to do a Snapchat now? And I'm like, no, that's not the right conversation for us to be having. But really understanding it, but also understanding exactly what Bettina was just saying, that within each, and how you have these conversations. There are shared values, right, and issues, but how we have those conversations we have to have the nuance really matters.
There's been a ton of attention over the last 10 years with like the near cratering of non-college educated white support for Democrats. But what receives a lot less attention is the fact that over that same period of time, there's been an 18-point shift in non-college educated, non-white support away from Democrats toward Republicans. And there are 1,000 reasons for this, but I think one of the big ones is that more and more today, our politics are not about class, it's not about generation even, it's more and more about culture. And more, okay. The fact that our politics is cultural is what explains Donald Trump. It's what explains the fact that people in the previous panel were talking about why is it that none of these indictments matter. It's because the people who support Donald Trump, he spoke to them culturally. When he came down that escalator and everyone on the left and many of us on the right, including myself, made fun of him, the way that he talked to dispossessed voters, these are people, I always remind people that when you think of the average Trump voter, these are people who, to me, you can draw a line starting with the war in Iraq, where there was a level of disillusionment that was created in terms of the way that people felt about the government and the government telling the truth that took us back to like Vietnam era levels of distrust, which we had rebounded from after 9/11. And then all of that went away after the war in Iraq. And then you add on top of that the financial crisis and the housing crisis and the fact that people, through no fault of their own, lost everything. Meanwhile, no one on Wall Street was ever held accountable. Throw in there the fact that corporations, by putting shareholders first as opposed to the communities in which they actually employ people, all of these manufacturing jobs got sent overseas, wiping out entire towns. Donald Trump was the first guy who spoke to those voters in a way that resonated with them, in a way that they felt was authentic, and he became, their support for him became cultural, and it became part of their identity. And that is why advertising and talking points are not going to peel Trump voters off of him.
I think we just have to, as the Black person on this panel, I'm going to say, I think we just have to be mindful when we talk about culture, what we're talking about, because I think we're talking about in a multicultural democracy. I think there is a culture of non-college educated white voters and white voters who are Trump voters. Yes, he made some inroads with African Americans and with Latinos, but I think when we say culture, particularly in this current environment, we have to be really mindful that there are a lot of different cultures.
Well, you can define it
but-
however you want.
Okay,
But that doesn't mean that if you live in a dispossessed county in northeast Iowa, I don't care what color you are, you have your own culture. And Trump spoke to people in a way where their support for him became a part of their culture.
Well, Black and Brown heard that very differently. I'll just put it that way. How about? And we'll go back to the panel.
I was going to say something about the decline in trust, and I think that's something that all of us are seeing in various avenues in our lives, in our professional lives. And I think one of the things that's happening that is both shared by generations and also divides the generations is this sense of trust in U.S. institutions. And by that, I mean not just government, but also things like church, universities, science, media, the military, you name it. And I think we are in a place where really all the generations have lost some element of trust, and Todd was speaking to that. But we also see this young and very diverse generation saying, this is not my America. This is run by old people. It's run by white people. A lot of people of color saying that. And so it's a moment where there is a big transition where I think a lot of people, and especially a lot of young people, are kind of saying, what is in this for me? And I don't mean to say that personally. What is in this for my kind of person, or my generation, or my group? Because I think so many folks have just experienced, including the folks in Northeast Iowa, have experienced this the last 10, 20, 30 years. It's just one where there's nothing to really rely on. And so, we kind of think about young people being disengaged, and I might say that old people are reacting by being enraged and outraged, and you're seeing two different kinds of reactions there. One thing I did want to say, and Bettina, I wonder if this would resonate with you and what you know about Latino voters, and sorry to group together that for a minute, but the survey data that I see when you ask folks, do you have hope in the future of this country? Latinos almost always score the highest on that measure, and I think that's a really interesting thing. And I actually wonder if that's one of the reasons why Republicans have been making inroads with Latino voters. In that the Republican message tends to be a little bit more on the "here's what's right with America" side than the "here's what needs to be fixed about America."
And I think you're right. I think, again, knowing that there's different ways to communicate, the economy, I'm a product of a Mexican immigrant and a Cuban exile. My family came here for opportunities, both politically and economically, and there's millions of people like me. And you have a hope for the future, and your job is, and I talked about it before, like you have this guilt that you need to do better because they sacrificed so much for you to come to live in the United States to have a better life. So there's a lot more, and I know that when I was at the party, we talked about the agenda of opportunity. Like, how do you talk about jobs? How do you talk about education? How do you do this? Talk about an agenda of opportunity for these groups of voters, and you can't just do it in Spanish because most Hispanics speak English. Most of them are born in the United States. It's a very kind of different. And I think also there has been a trend that Obama had a ridiculously high amount of a massive coalition, a diverse coalition. I don't see, unless there's an incredible candidate that comes, that happening again. You're going to have lots of different types of, it's going to be different. And I remember working for McCain and working for Romney and working for Bush. They would always say, oh, this Republican's the most racist human being ever, and he's going to destroy your life. You hear that so many times, at some point, you're going to be like, not everyone can be the most racist human being on the entire life, and you figure out what is better for me. And I talked to a few of my friends who are pollsters in the Latino community, and two different people told me basically the same kind of story that came out of a focus group that said, I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but during his time, my job, my business, because Hispanics have a higher propensity to start businesses than most other Americans, was doing really well. Right now, I am struggling. So I'd rather have a president who I don't always agree with, but I'm having a better life than a president who I might like more, but that my business is struggling. And I know that's anecdotal, but I found it fascinating that I heard that from two different focus groups of two different Hispanic pollsters.
Thank you. As we've talked about demographics, we've talked about age and different generations. We've talked about Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans. What we haven't talked about yet, and I want to get your opinions on, is in the United States, there's an increasing divide between urban areas and rural areas. And then, of course, suburban areas as being the battlegrounds. I wonder if anyone can just comment on that divide and how the parties are trying to navigate appeals to people in those different parts of our country.
Sure. I mean, there's a geographic divide. Take any rural community, you basically put on steroids all of these other issues that we've been talking about, because they feel on top of everything else that they are being left behind, that all of the focus is on people who live either in the cities, exurbs, suburbs, that the concerns that they have, whether it's agricultural, educational, technological, there's still a lot of rural areas where they're on dial-up. And so the concerns that these voters have are exacerbated by all of the other divides that we have, and there's a real effort. You've seen it to some degree of success in the Midwest when Democrat candidates make a concerted effort to go talk to rural voters. We see it in our data. It helps them. For us, I think that I don't think we ever stopped focusing on rural voters, perhaps to the detriment of the suburbs sometimes, but there is a real divide there.
Yeah, Karen.
Absolutely. But I think the other element we have to talk about, which we haven't yet, is the pandemic and the impact that the pandemic had on who's rural and who's suburban and who's urban, because a lot of people moved out of cities and went to more rural areas. And it's interesting, I was working on a campaign in North Carolina, and one of the things we saw was that as you had more COVID refugees, right, as they were called, coming from the Northeast down to North Carolina, there was a lot of resentment among rural voters. In these focus groups, people would say, I can barely pay for the basic necessities, and these people who are coming down here from, New York, they have 3 carts full of stuff, and I can barely do one. And so I do think we have to be, I think Democrats, all of us we have to be mindful in these demographic shifts that have happened post-pandemic. What else is happening for people in terms of how these communities are reforming into new communities where you have newer people and people who've been there for generations? And certainly there's been a lot of effort around, wiring places, how long have we been talking about, getting people out of dial-up? Obviously, President Biden has tried to make important strides on that. But I wanted to also mention something that Bettina pointed to, which is, ironically, we have great economic data under President Biden, and I hear people say, but I felt like my business was doing great under Trump, or let's say my 401k, and you're like, well, that's not quite, but anyway. But at the same time, again, the pandemic happened. And so one of the challenges is, and I think Kiki mentioned this, I think America is also still, and I think young people in particular, how they think about their lives and their future. I mean, if you were going off to college and then all of a sudden the pandemic happened and you were home with your parents for a year, yikes, because I would have killed myself. And I say that, I should not make a joke about that, obviously, given what's happening with young people, but I just mean like I might have pulled my hair out. I think, we have to also be mindful that there are a lot of different currents affecting how people are feeling right now about the economy, about their lives, about their futures, particularly when we're talking about young voters, because they've had such a vastly different experience than most of us in this room who didn't have a pandemic sort of upend whatever we thought our life was going to be when we were, at that age.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience, if anyone would like to. Yeah, go ahead. Microphone.
Cultural institutions, okay? And so, Todd, and we've talked about a loss of trust for traditional institutions, right? News, science, government. But we know that in communities of color, there have been strong relationships with cultural institutions, Catholic churches, AME church, right? Other cultural institutions, heritage-based institutions. But for Gen Zers, younger people, does that relationship exist at that age? Did it before? Does it now? Was that trust there to begin with? Does it have influence now for that generation? And if not, are there trusting influencers that are culturally based?
I'm sure there's other people that probably can provide some more context.
Besides TikTok.
Yeah.
Right.
I think in general in America, we are a society that doesn't always trust institutions. Younger people tend to trust a little bit more than some others. I think uniquely from my Hispanic experience, a lot of us left our parents left their countries because they had no faith in their government institutions. So I think it's a complex. That's why I don't like saying one vote. I think it all depends on like where you sit is where you stand kind of thing. Lens of it. For younger demographics, I'm sure many of this panel can talk about how much they depend on each other for information, how much they depend on their peer group to get information. I think just to touch on what you said, what Todd said, for many Republicans especially, there seems to be, especially in the last few years and with COVID, that a lot of the institutions have been led by elites and that don't speak for them and are making decisions that don't reflect their values or their culture. And there's a lot of people that feel that some of the decisions that were made are against their values, or if a constant phrase that happens in my world is like, oh my gosh, if this would have happened under Trump, they would have gone insane. If Trump would have done what Biden did, they would have been crazy. And something as simple as what we saw with like social media, with the government telling social media what they could say and not say, that, under another presidency, the media would have probably said fascism, that the government was controlling what information could and could not be shared. And I think it talks to culture. I think it talks to people feeling like elitism, and it makes less trust in institutions because you don't know who to trust. So you go more interior and trust your world more because some of the people that are supposed to be arbitrary don't feel very arbitrary.
It's leading to further bifurcation in our society because we've already, for 2 decades now, we've had people on the right We have our own media ecosystem. People on the left have their own media ecosystem. But now on a generational level, almost 50% of Gen Zers say they get their news from TikTok. And TikTok is created by people who are Gen Zers. So it's now this generation is creating news for their own generation. So that then becomes a circular conversation, and it makes it more difficult, even more so than it already is, for us to have conversations that reach outside of the circles we already live in.
And I think it's beyond just Gen Zers, right? Like all these communities are kind of, you don't know who to trust. So you try to trust people that at least connect with you in one way or another, that you're hoping, maybe you have a little bit more information than I do. Not a lot, like if you're a mom, that I was joking around before I sat down. My mom text group was insane this morning as everyone's trying to share information because they know they can trust each other. They don't always know if they can trust other people.
I'm just going to add that, I mean, it's been true for some time. People trust information that they get from someone they know more than anything else, which is why knocking on doors, is still very effective. Because if your neighbor knocks on your door and says, "Hey, this is why you should vote for so-and-so," or storm's coming, I don't know, whatever, you're more likely, to believe it. And technology, I think this is one of the innovations in technology I think both sides are focusing on, particularly given that we also know we can all choose the information that we want, when we want it, how we want it, whatever platform we want. We also can all create. We're all information, content creators. And so in that environment, trying to then persuade and communicate information, you have to be able to be on those platforms. You have to be thinking about what kind of content is going to resonate with people. And it can't necessarily just be top down. I think young people have really done a great job of waking the rest of us up, that we have to really get on our game again in terms of being more creative in how we're talking about issues, what the content looks like, and how do we get into those streams so that someone will retweet it or somebody will reshare it. And I think that's actually one of the challenges both sides face, just in terms of communicating and messaging. And young people really change that.
Social media and TikTokers are today what Radio Row was to us yesterday.
One word I just want to mention in that vein that hasn't come up is authenticity. And so you think about somebody like Taylor Swift, think about somebody like Deion Sanders, right? Who these are personalities and celebrities and culture makers who young people especially, but a lot of people perceive as authentic. And I think that idea, authenticity, butts up against distrust and disengagement from institutions in a way that I think we need to take more awareness of, more engagement with.
Someone brought up Taylor Swift.
How long has it been since we got to Taylor Swift?
The Swifties are everywhere, aren't they? Okay, who's next? Another question, Eugene?
I've never needed a mic. I'm curious what you guys think. Patrick, this may be a question to start, for you to start with, is when I talk to younger folks, I'm only 34, but people that I'm aging young. Thank you. Everyone continue to say how young I am. But one thing when I talk to my siblings or their friends is that in reporting on that is that they have realized and really glommed onto this idea that's probably right, is that political power is not the strongest power you can have. It is maybe sometimes not the most effective power and the most effective way to implement change. And so it kind of speaks to their apathy about politics and being involved in politics. But I'm curious what you think, is there a way that politicians and people who work in politicians and reporters, when we're doing this and creating this ecosystem, how do you speak to that? And I guess, if you even agree with the idea that for them, political power, one of the reasons they're not as involved is because political power to them is just one tool as opposed to the tool, which I think is a change.
One thing to keep in mind, and it's helpful to mention here in Westminster-style parliamentary democracy, that the American system makes it very, very difficult to trace who's responsible for what and how you get things changed, right? So for a big issue for a lot of young people was student loan forgiveness, okay? So this is a huge issue in the United States, huge issue for young people, big generational divide on this, right? and you elect a guy who says, I'm gonna enact student loan forgiveness, and it doesn't happen because we have this other thing called the Supreme Court that says it's unconstitutional, and the way you did it going around Congress wasn't right. How does anybody make sense of that? That's pretty complicated, right? So I think part of the story is just this diffusion of responsibility that makes it it's difficult to report on, probably if you're in the media, and it's difficult for ordinary Americans to understand because there's so many different players you have to make sense of. That's my first thought.
Anyone else want to comment on that? Adam?
Thanks. I have a question about how far skepticism or opposition to distrust of institutions extends. And I suppose the question really is about whether it extends to some fundamental idea of America itself. I want to try to ask this question without getting sort of too abstract about it. But we know that the survey data shows that trust in the Supreme Court and in Congress and in the presidency and even in the military is at low levels. All those individual, as it were, elements of the American system. But it would be possible, I think, to kind of zoom out and with a kind of historical perspective, look at the United States today and think, what's different here about the 2020s and certainly in the Trump era compared to every previous phase in American history going back to the founding, is that is the lack of a reverent discourse around the Constitution. That's not disappeared, but that the consensus around it seems to have broken. Maybe that's solely about Donald Trump, but maybe it's something bigger than that. That if you do a discourse analysis of presidential inaugural addresses, Trump's inaugural address broke completely from all tradition. It just didn't contain things that every previous inaugural address had contained. And essentially what that was the due reverence to the traditions and to in that broad sense, the institutions of the Republic. If Trump wins again, of course, he said he will pardon the January 6th, in quotes, insurrectionists, unquote, the political prisoners, and evidently that isn't the problem for the Republican base. So you can see what the Democratic narrative is very clear here. So Biden's narrative, we had some discussion of this in the previous panel. The Biden narrative will be obviously backed up by the traditional media, will be that one of the things that's on the ballot in November, if it's a Biden-Trump matchup, is democracy itself. And there will be millions of Americans who sincerely and profoundly believe that. One of the things I'm interested in is really from the Republicans on the panel, how you respond to that critique. I mean, I presume you reject it, but I'm just genuinely curious as an outside observer, whether you share that sense that we are potentially at a point of historic fracture in terms of this general consensus that the American Republic as a whole is something that reaches across parties.
Right, well, Bettina and Todd, you're the target.
Bettina.
I reject it. I'll start there. And I don't think that most Republican voters care what Trump says on his inauguration day.
Agree.
I think they care more about results, and I think they care more about someone that stands up for them. I think that there's a lot of them who bleed red, white, and blue. They love America more than anything. They believe in America. There's a lot of conversations of what is the best way to move forward. I think someone said this before, but I think it's, to be honest, I think it's a Democrat talking point to try to scare people like, oh, our democracy at risk. I don't believe that. I think that we have a healthy democracy. I come from, and again, from my perspective, like, my parents came from a broken democracy. My grandfather was a political prisoner in Cuba because he didn't want to be part of the political system. Like, that is a broken democracy. We have differing point of views, and we have a lot of passion, and that is great. And there's moments where we're not as proud of than others, but we continue to elect people. We continue to move forward. And one of the things that make America great is that we are a society that recognizes our own faults. And we're a society that tries to figure out how do we make tomorrow better than it was today.
Yeah, I would reject it as well. In fact, I think one of the most basic talking points for most Republicans when they run for office is some sort of reverence and strict constructionist view of the Constitution. To me, what I think you are seeing play out for more than 200 years, we've had, not with a perfect record, certainly, but we've had a democratization of power. But throughout that time, information was an aristocracy. It was controlled by a couple of families, a couple of really, really wealthy individuals, and a couple of corporations. And that allowed us to have a national consensus and a national dialogue where basic facts could be shared across the country. Now you have power continuing to be democratized, but now information is also democratized, and anyone can say anything to any group of people. You can go out and choose your own, adventure news source, and it's making, it is creating enormous challenges that I think as a country we are still trying to figure out how to manage and to get through, because we no longer have a shared set of facts. And it certainly puts a strain on our democratic system, but I don't think the root of it is because people have abandoned any level of reverence for the Constitution.
I would just say, I agree with Todd that it's a good Republican talking point when it comes to you hear a lot about reverence for the Constitution, but then we hear about let's overturn birthright citizenship and some other things that seem pretty much not in line with the Constitution. What I would say, though, is I think we experience democracy differently, and there are a lot of different ideas about what our democracy should be. At the same time, when it has gone to the voters, I can only go by what they have told us the last 3 times, they have been very concerned about the extremism that we're seeing from the Republican Party. And they voted for Joe Biden, and they voted overwhelmingly for Democrats and against, not just for Democrats, but against extremists who I think espoused a lot of anti-democratic ideas in the 2022 election. I think in the special elections that we've had, we can talk about Kansas, we can talk about Wisconsin, we can talk about, in other places, again, and frankly, when in a lot of research that I've seen recently, people are very concerned about the state of our democracy. I think, though, that means different things to different people, and certainly to a point Anzo mentioned, that's part of why you saw the president talking about it in 2022, trying to bring us to a shared idea of what democracy means. And frankly, for a lot of Americans, when we talk about reproductive freedom, that is part of democracy as well. And I think we're certainly going to continue to have the conversation over the course of the next year and a half.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We have to stop the conversation now. Thank our panelists for this great conversation.